Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you are from and what time you are watching. And did you know that 97% of you guys watching aren't subscribed yet? So make sure to subscribe and like. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Sleep Study. In the winter of 2019, a private research facility opened in Mississauga on a quiet street near the Credit River. The building was unmarked except for a small brass plate that read, Dormire Cognitive Research Institute. Dr. Petra Valmont ran the facility, and she was looking for participants for what seemed like the easiest money anyone could make. Sleep for 3 nights, get monitored, walk away with $2,000. Callum Hendricks was a line cook at a restaurant downtown, pulling double shifts and barely making rent. When he saw the ad online, he didn't hesitate. He showed up on a Monday evening with his overnight bag, ready to sleep in a lab for science. The facility was strange from the moment he walked in. Everything was white. White walls, white floors, white furniture. Even the staff wore white. Dr. Valmont greeted him personally, a tall woman with silver hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She explained the process. Sensors on his head, cameras recording, nothing invasive. They wanted to study REM cycles and dream patterns. Standard stuff. Callum's room was comfortable enough. A decent bed, a nightstand, a bathroom, no windows. He figured that was normal for a sleep study. You wouldn't want outside light interfering with the research. The first night was fine. He slept deeply, dreamed about his childhood home in Thunder Bay, woke up refreshed. Dr. Valmont reviewed his results and seemed pleased. She asked him detailed questions about his dreams. What color was the sky? What did the grass smell like? Could he taste anything? Callum thought the questions were odd, but answered honestly. The second night, things changed. He dreamed. He was still in the facility. In his dream, he woke up, got out of bed, and walked down the white hallways. He found other rooms, other participants, all sleeping. But when he looked closely at their faces, they were all him. 20 versions of Callum Hendricks, all sleeping in identical white rooms. When he actually woke up, he was standing in the hallway. Dr. Valmont found him there at 4 a.m. She didn't seem surprised. She guided him back to his room, her hand cold on his elbow. Sleepwalking is common, she said. The sensors will have recorded everything. But Callum didn't feel like he'd been sleepwalking. He felt like he'd been awake. The hallway had been real. The other rooms had been real. Those other versions of himself had been real. The third night, he tried to stay awake. He paced his room, splashed water on his face, bit his tongue. But eventually, his eyes grew heavy. The moment he closed them, he was standing in the hallway again. This time, the other versions of himself were awake too. They stood in their doorways, staring at him. One of them spoke. "You're still dreaming," he said. "You never woke up from the first night." Callum turned to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly long. He ran and ran, passing hundreds of white doors, thousands of white doors. Behind each one he could hear breathing, his own breathing, multiplied into infinity. When Dr. Valmont found him the next morning, he was in his bed, tangled in sheets, soaked with sweat. He was screaming. She had to sedate him. They let him go early. Paid him the full amount, even though he'd only completed 2 nights. Callum took the money and tried to forget about the facility. But here's the disturbing part. 3 weeks later, Callum woke up in his apartment and couldn't remember falling asleep. He'd been making dinner, and then suddenly it was morning. No memory of getting into bed, no memory of the hours in between. It kept happening. He'd be at work, turn to grab a pan, and suddenly his shift would be over. He'd be walking down the street, blink, and find himself at home. Hours would disappear. He went back to the facility to confront Dr. Valmont. but the building was empty, completely abandoned. The brass plate was gone. When he asked neighbors about the research institute, they looked at him confused. "That building's been empty for 5 years," they said. Callum started keeping a journal, trying to track his waking hours. But the journal entries didn't match his memories. According to what he'd written, he'd been returning to the facility every night. He'd been sleeping in that white room over and over, but he had no memory of it. Last anyone heard, Callum had checked himself into a hospital. He told the doctors he couldn't tell anymore when he was awake and when he was asleep. He said he'd found others like him, other participants from the study, all experiencing the same thing. They'd meet in what they thought was a support group, but none of them could confirm if the meetings were real or if they were all dreaming together. The hospital has no record of anyone named Callum Hendricks. But sometimes, late at night, staff report seeing a man wandering the halls, asking everyone he meets the same question. "Am I awake right now? Please, you have to tell me. Am I awake?" Story 2. The Garden Plot. In a community garden in London, Ontario, between the Thames River and a row of Victorian houses, something impossible started growing in the summer of 2021. The garden was run by a collective of residents, mostly retirees, and young families looking to grow their own vegetables. Everyone had their own plot, marked with handmade signs and separated by gravel paths. It was the kind of peaceful place where people would spend Sunday mornings pulling weeds and comparing tomatoes. Dinah Kozloff had plot 17. She was a dental hygienist, 43 years old, recently divorced, and she'd taken up gardening as therapy. She'd planted the usual things: tomatoes, zucchini, herbs. She was meticulous about her garden, there every evening after work, watering and pruning and talking to her plants like they were friends. In late July, she noticed something strange in the soil near her basil plants. Something white and smooth, like a pebble. She brushed the dirt away and stopped breathing. It was a tooth, a human molar to be exact, healthy, white, fully formed. Dinah had seen thousands of teeth in her career. She knew what she was looking at, but it made no sense. She dug around it carefully and found it wasn't loose in the soil. It was growing, rooted, connected to something beneath the earth. She should have stopped digging. She should have called someone. But her hands kept moving, clearing away dirt, following the root structure. The tooth wasn't alone. There were others growing in a cluster like bulbs, incisors, canines, premolars, all of them perfect and white, all of them rooted in the earth, like plants. Dinah sat back, her hands covered in soil, staring at her impossible harvest. She looked around the garden. No one else was there. It was dusk, and she was alone with her discovery. She didn't tell anyone, not at first. She covered the teeth back up and went home. She told herself she'd imagined it, that the stress of the divorce was making her see things. But the next evening, she went back. The teeth had grown. Not much, maybe half an inch taller, but they'd definitely grown. And there were more of them. What had been a cluster of 6 or 7 was now 15, maybe 20. They pushed up through the soil like some obscene crop. Dinah started documenting everything. She took photos, measurements, notes. She was a scientist at heart, trained to observe and record. The teeth grew faster than any plant she'd ever seen. Within a week, they were 2 inches tall. Within 2 weeks, they were 4 inches. And she could see that they weren't just teeth anymore. They were forming structures, jawbones, partial skulls. She stopped going to work. She called in sick, then stopped calling at all. She spent every moment at plot 17, watching her garden of bones grow. Other gardeners noticed, of course. They'd ask her what she was growing under that tarp she'd put up. She'd tell them it was a composting experiment, something for root vegetables. They'd nod and move on. People in community gardens respected each other's space. By August, the structures were complete. Dinah had grown 7 complete human skulls. They sat in the soil like some grotesque art installation, their empty eye sockets staring up at the sky. The roots went deep, and when she tried to pull one up, it wouldn't budge. They were anchored to something far below. That's when she noticed the faces. Each skull didn't look random. They looked like people. Specific people. The bone structure, the dental work, the shape of the jaw. One of them looked like her ex-husband, Marcus. Another looked like her mother, who'd died 6 years ago. A third looked like her sister, Tamara, who lived in Ottawa. Dinah stopped sleeping. She'd sit in her garden at night with a flashlight, watching the skulls, waiting for something to happen. She started hearing sounds, grinding sounds like teeth chewing, whispering sounds like voices coming from beneath the earth. The other gardeners were getting concerned. They'd seen her sitting there at 3 a.m. talking to the tarp. The garden collective held a meeting. They decided to check on her plot. When they pulled back the tarp, Dinah was ready to show them, ready to prove she wasn't crazy, but the skulls were gone. The plot was empty except for dead basil plants and normal soil. The other gardeners looked at her with pity. They suggested she take some time off, maybe see someone. But Dinah knew what she'd seen. She went home and looked at her photos. They were all there. Clear, undeniable evidence. She tried to show people, but every time she opened the photos on her phone, they showed normal plants, tomatoes and herbs, no teeth, no bones. She went back to the garden that night with a shovel. If the skulls were gone, maybe they'd just grown deeper. Maybe they'd burrowed down. She started digging. She dug for hours, past midnight, past dawn. She dug until her hands bled, and the hole was 6 feet deep. The other gardeners found her in the morning, standing in the pit, covered in dirt, laughing. She'd found something. At the bottom of the hole, she'd found a mouth. A massive mouth, easily 10 feet wide, full of thousands of teeth. And it was smiling. The collective banned Dinah from the garden. They filled in the hole and replanted plot 17. But here's what they won't tell you. 3 other gardeners have reported finding teeth in their plots. Small ones at first, just molars breaking through the soil. They haven't told the collective. They're keeping it quiet, watching their crops, wondering what they're really growing in the earth along the Thames River. And Dinah? She moved away from London. But she still has dreams about the garden. Dreams about what lives beneath all of our gardens, waiting to be fed, waiting to grow its crop of bones. Story 3. The Rotary Phone. In a high-rise apartment building in North York, on the 23rd floor, Greta Sorensen found an old rotary phone in the trash room. It was harvest gold, a color that screamed 1970-something, with a coiled cord and a dial that clicked satisfyingly when you turned it. Greta was 28 and worked in graphic design. She had a thing for vintage items, for objects with history. She took the phone home, cleaned it up, and plugged it into the phone jack in her apartment, curious if it would even work with modern lines. It rang that same night. The sound was loud and jarring, nothing like a cell phone. A real mechanical bell ringing inside the plastic housing. Greta picked up, expecting a wrong number or maybe a telemarketer. "Don't take the elevator tomorrow morning," a voice said. Her voice. Greta's own voice, but older somehow, more tired. "Take the stairs. The elevator will fail between floors 19 and 18. You'll be trapped for 6 hours." The line went dead. Greta stood in her apartment, holding the receiver, her heart pounding. Some kind of prank. Had to be. Maybe someone had hacked the line, used some kind of voice modulation software. But the phone was ancient. It wasn't connected to anything except the wall jack. The next morning, she took the elevator. Of course she did. She wasn't going to walk down 23 flights of stairs because of a weird phone call. The elevator worked fine. She got to the lobby, went to work, came home without incident. The phone rang again that night. "You didn't listen," the voice said. Her voice, but even more tired now, strained. "The elevator was fine today, but now you've made it worse. Don't answer the door on Thursday. When the courier comes at 2:15, don't answer it." "Who is this?" Greta demanded. "I'm you, from the end. I don't have much time left, and I'm trying to help you, but you have to listen. Don't answer the door on Thursday." The line went dead again. Greta unplugged the phone. She shoved it in her closet. She tried to forget about it. But Thursday came, and at 2:14, she was standing by her door, waiting. A courier knocked at 2:15 exactly. Greta stood frozen, her hand on the doorknob, remembering the warning. She didn't answer. The courier knocked again, then left. Greta checked her phone. No missed deliveries, no notifications. According to tracking, no delivery had been attempted. But she'd heard the knock. She'd seen the shadow under her door. That night, the phone rang, even though it was unplugged, even though it was buried under coats in her closet. She could hear it through the door, that mechanical bell ringing and ringing. She pulled it out and answered. "Thank you," her voice said, and this time it was crying. "Thank you. You don't know what you avoided. But there's more. So much more. On Saturday, don't go to the coffee shop on Yonge Street, the one you always go to. At 11:30, a car will lose control. If you're standing outside with your coffee, waiting for the light to change, you'll die. This is the first time you'll die, but not the last." "What do you mean, the first time?" "I've died 47 times, Greta. Every time I wake up back at the day I found this phone. And every time I call myself, trying to give warnings. You're number 48. Please be the one who listens." The calls kept coming. Every night, her future self would warn her about something. Don't take a specific subway train. Don't eat the salad from the deli. Don't walk past the construction site. Avoid a certain person. Cancel a doctor's appointment. Greta's life became a maze of avoidance. She stopped going out unless absolutely necessary. She quit her job and worked from home. She had groceries delivered and stopped seeing friends. Every decision was filtered through the warnings from the phone. But the warnings were getting darker. It wasn't just accidents anymore. Her future self was telling her about things that didn't make sense. Don't look in the mirror on Tuesday. You won't recognize what looks back. Don't sleep with your window open. Something's been watching. The woman in 2304 isn't human. Stay away from her. Greta started documenting everything. She recorded the calls, took notes, tried to find a pattern. The warnings were coming more frequently now, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. Her future self sounded increasingly desperate, increasingly strange. "How do I stop this?" Greta finally asked during one call. "How do I make it end?" There was a long silence. Then, "You don't. I've tried everything. Destroyed the phone, moved away, stopped listening to the warnings. Nothing works. Every path leads to the day you find the phone. We're in a loop, Greta. 48 iterations deep, and I still haven't found the way out." "Then what do I do?" "That's why I'm calling. I think I finally understand. The phone isn't warning you. It's creating the danger. Every warning I give you changes something, and those changes cause new problems. I've been killing us over and over by trying to save us." "So what do I do?" Greta repeated. "Stop answering," her future self said. "Let it ring. Break the loop. That's what I'm going to do now. This is the last call I'm making. I'm putting down the phone. Whatever happens to me, happens. I'm freeing you from this." The line went dead. The phone didn't ring again. Not that night, not the next day. Greta waited, but the silence held. She felt like she should be relieved, but instead she felt terrified. She'd become dependent on the warnings. Without them, how would she know what dangers were waiting? She started seeing the number 48 everywhere, on receipts, in license plates, on building addresses. She'd be walking down the street and count 48 steps between streetlights. She'd wake up at 4:48 in the morning, every morning. Then one day she saw her own face in a crowd. An older version of herself, maybe 50 years old, standing across the street. Their eyes met. The older Greta smiled, sad and knowing, and picked up a cell phone. She put it to her ear. In Greta's apartment, the rotary phone began to ring. She hasn't answered it yet. She's been sitting in her apartment for 6 days now, listening to it ring. The phone is unplugged. It's disconnected from the wall. She's even smashed it with a hammer. But it still rings. And she knows, eventually, she'll answer. Because at the end of all the warnings and all the loops, there's a version of her that knows how this ends. And that version is calling, right now, trying to warn her about the one danger she can't avoid. Herself. Story 4. The Faces. In Hamilton, at a community center near the harbor, a support group met every Tuesday evening at 7. The group had no official name, no website, no public listings. People found out about it through word of mouth, or sometimes they'd just show up, drawn by something they couldn't explain. The group was for people with a very specific problem. They all had the same face, not similar faces, not related faces. The exact same face, same bone structure, same eyes, same features. They'd never met before, weren't related, came from different backgrounds and different parts of the province. But when they looked at each other, they were looking at themselves. Vaughn Lister was the first to notice. He was a paramedic, 31 years old, working the overnight shift. He'd been grabbing coffee at a 24-hour diner when he saw himself sitting in a booth by the window. Not someone who looked like him. Himself? Same scar on the left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Same slight asymmetry in his ears. Same everything. The other man had looked up, seen Vaughn, and gone pale. They'd stared at each other for a long moment, both frozen. Then the other man had thrown money on the table and run. Vaughn tracked him down through pure stubbornness and some questionable use of social media. The man's name was Leslie Prout. He was an accountant, lived in Oakville, had no connection to Vaughn at all. But when they met in person, the resemblance was undeniable. They weren't twins. Twins have small differences. They were identical in a way that shouldn't be possible. They'd found others, first 2 more, then 6, then 12. All across southern Ontario, people with the exact same face, different ages, different genders, different lives, but the same face. They'd started meeting at the community center, trying to understand what was happening to them. The group had 23 members when things got bad. It started with a woman named Simone Thwaite. She'd been quiet during most meetings, sitting in the back, just listening. But one Tuesday, she arrived agitated. She said she'd been having dreams where she wasn't herself anymore. She'd be living someone else's life, making someone else's decisions, but wearing her face. Their face. Others admitted to having similar dreams. They'd wake up with memories that weren't theirs. Vaughn found himself knowing facts about accounting he'd never learned. Leslie started having panic attacks during medical emergencies he'd never witnessed. Simone could speak Portuguese fluently, a language she'd never studied, but one that a member named Torsten de Saal had grown up speaking. The group members were bleeding into each other. Their lives, their memories, their skills. It was like they were all pieces of the same person, scattered across Ontario, slowly being drawn back together. They brought in experts, doctors, psychologists, geneticists. No one could explain it. DNA tests showed they were completely unrelated. Brain scans showed nothing unusual, but the phenomenon was accelerating. Members started losing time. They'd be at work, then suddenly find themselves across town in another member's apartment. They'd look in the mirror and not recognize their own clothes, their own surroundings. One member, a man named Ridge Cantwell, woke up in a hospital. He'd been in a car accident, but he had no memory of driving. Another member, Paloma Riggs, had been driving. She'd looked down at the steering wheel and forgotten how to drive, forgotten where she was going, because in that moment she wasn't Paloma anymore. She was Ridge. The group stopped meeting in person. It was too dangerous. When they were in the same room, the effect was stronger. They'd start finishing each other's sentences, moving in sync, thinking the same thoughts. It felt like being absorbed, like dissolving into something larger. Vaughn tried to research it. He found references in obscure medical journals, old case studies. There was a theory, fringe science, about quantum identity. The idea that consciousness wasn't as individualized as we thought. That in rare cases, one consciousness could be spread across multiple bodies, like one signal picked up by multiple receivers. The theory suggested that eventually the signal would consolidate. All the receivers would tune to the same frequency, and the multiple bodies would essentially become one person, living in parallel. That's what was happening to them. They were all becoming the same person. The group tried to fight it. They moved to different parts of the province, cut off contact, tried to live completely separate lives. But it didn't matter. The connection was getting stronger. They'd be sitting alone and suddenly feel what another member was feeling. They'd know things they couldn't possibly know. They'd share pain, share fear, share everything. One by one, members stopped responding. Not dead, just gone. Their families would report them missing. But the truth was stranger. They'd simply merged. There'd be a moment where they'd stop being an individual and become part of the collective consciousness. Their body would still be walking around, still functioning. But the person they'd been was gone, absorbed into the whole. Vaughn was one of the last holdouts. He documented everything, trying to warn others, trying to find a solution. But he could feel it happening. He'd be thinking his own thoughts, and then suddenly he'd be thinking Leslie's thoughts, or Simone's thoughts, or thoughts from members whose names he'd never learned. The last entry in his journal read, "I can feel all of them now. 23 people, 23 lives, all pressing in on me. Or maybe I'm pressing in on them. I don't know who's absorbing who anymore. I look in the mirror and see our face, and I can't remember which one of us I am. Is this what it feels like to die? Or is this what it feels like to finally be complete?" The community center still has a room reserved for Tuesday evenings at 7, but no one shows up anymore. Or maybe someone does. Maybe there's a person who sits in that room, wearing a face that 23 people used to wear, living 23 lives at once, thinking 23 thoughts simultaneously. And here's the really disturbing part. People around Hamilton have started reporting seeing this person. Always alone, always wearing the same neutral expression. They show up at places where the group members used to go. Vaughn's fire station, Leslie's office, Simone's favorite cafe. And sometimes, people report that when they look at this person, just for a moment, they see themselves, their own face looking back at them, before it shifts back to that neutral composite face. The group is growing again, just not the way anyone expected. Story 5. The Reenactment. Fort George, near Niagara-on-the-Lake, is a historic site where they do War of 1812 reenactments every summer. People dress in period costumes, fire replica muskets, and pretend to be soldiers from 200 years ago. It's usually harmless fun, educational entertainment for tourists. The reenactment on August 14th, 2020, was different. The event started normally. 53 participants, all volunteers, all experienced with historical reenactments. They had British soldiers, American soldiers, officers, civilians. Everyone had researched their roles, learned their lines, practiced their movements. This was supposed to be the biggest and most authentic reenactment Fort George had ever hosted. Nikolai Redford was playing a British lieutenant. He'd been doing reenactments for 12 years, knew every detail of the period, every nuance of military protocol. He took it seriously, maybe too seriously. His uniform was hand-sewn, his equipment authentic down to the buttons. The reenactment began at 2 in the afternoon. The battle was scripted to last 45 minutes. The British would advance, the Americans would defend, there'd be some dramatic speeches, some staged casualties, and then everyone would take a bow and go have lemonade. But at 2:30, something changed. Nikolai was in the middle of ordering his men to advance when he felt a strange disorientation. The fort looked different. The walls looked older, more damaged. The sky seemed wrong, too gray. He shook it off, assumed it was heat exhaustion. August in a wool uniform was brutal. Then he noticed the smell. Gunpowder, but not the clean smell of blanks. Real gunpowder, acrid and sharp. And underneath it, something worse. Blood and sweat and fear. The American soldiers were firing, and Nikolai's instincts took over. He hit the ground, heart pounding, because those musket balls were real. He could hear them whistling past, could hear them thudding into wood and earth. Someone screamed, and it wasn't a theatrical scream. It was the sound of someone actually hurt. He looked at his men. They were terrified. Their faces were wrong, streaked with dirt and exhaustion that wasn't makeup. A young man beside him, playing a private, was bleeding from a wound in his shoulder. Real blood, pumping out, soaking his uniform. "What's happening?" the young man gasped, and Nikolai didn't have an answer. The battle kept going. No one knew how to stop it. They were trapped in it, carried along by something they couldn't control. Nikolai tried to break character, tried to call out that this was wrong, that they needed to stop. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. Orders to advance, to fire, to hold the line. Words from 200 years ago, spoken in his voice, but not from his mind. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The battle should have been over, but it kept going. Participants fell wounded, and when they tried to stand up and walk away, they couldn't. They were pinned in their roles, acting out history whether they wanted to or not. By evening, the tourists were gone. The fort staff was trying to intervene, but they couldn't get close. There was something around the reenactment area, an invisible barrier that pushed them back. They could see what was happening inside, could hear the screams and the gunfire, but they couldn't reach the participants. Night fell. The battle continued by moonlight. Nikolai had lost track of time. He'd been fighting for hours, maybe days. His mind felt fragmented, split between his own thoughts and the thoughts of the soldier he was playing. Lieutenant James Wickham, who died at Fort George in 1813, shot through the chest while defending the powder magazine. Nikolai could feel Wickham's memories, his fear before battle, his pride in his men, his last moments bleeding out on the ground. The memories were becoming Nikolai's memories. He was losing himself, becoming the ghost he was portraying. Other participants were experiencing the same thing. A woman playing a civilian nurse found herself with knowledge of 19th century medicine. A man playing an American captain couldn't remember his real name, could only remember his character's name. They were being erased, overwritten by the past. The battle reached its historical conclusion at dawn. The British won, as they had in 1813. The Americans retreated. The casualties were counted. 17 wounded, 4 dead. And when it was over, when the sun rose on August 15th, the participants collapsed where they stood. They woke up in hospital. Emergency services had rushed in the moment the barrier dropped. The wounded were really wounded. The dead were really dead. 4 people who'd come to the fort for a fun reenactment had died of musket ball wounds and bayonet injuries, weapons that shouldn't have been capable of causing harm. Nikolai survived, but he was changed. He couldn't remember large parts of his life before the reenactment. He had memories of things that happened 200 years ago instead. He knew the names of men he'd never met, remembered battles he'd never fought. The line between Nikolai Redford and Lieutenant James Wickham had been permanently blurred. Most of the participants left the hospital with similar problems. They had gaps in their memories, filled with historical details that shouldn't be there. Some of them spoke with accents they'd never had before. Some of them had skills they'd never learned, like loading and firing 19th century weapons, or treating wounds with primitive medical techniques. Psychologists called it mass dissociation, a shared psychotic break triggered by the intensity of the roleplay. But that didn't explain the physical injuries. That didn't explain the 4 deaths. That didn't explain how 53 people could all share the same delusion with such perfect historical accuracy. Fort George canceled all future reenactments. The site was closed for a year. When it reopened, it was only for tours, no more live events. But Nikolai still goes there. He stands in the spot where he fell during the reenactment, where Lieutenant Wickham fell in 1813. He says he can still hear it sometimes, the sound of the battle continuing. He says the past isn't really past. It's still happening, playing out over and over, and all it takes is the right conditions, the right people, and you can fall into it. Other historical sites in Ontario have quietly changed their policies. No more intense reenactments. No more getting too deep into character. Because the fear is that what happened at Fort George could happen anywhere history soaked into the ground. The past wants to be relived. And sometimes, it chooses who will relive it. Story 6. The Smell. In an apartment building in Ottawa, near Lansdowne Park, a smell appeared in the 3rd-floor hallway on a Tuesday morning in March 2021. It wasn't a bad smell exactly. It was sweet and nostalgic, like vanilla and old paper and something floral underneath. The first person to notice was Caspian Holtz, who lived in Unit 304. He stepped into the hallway on his way to work and stopped, confused. The smell was strong and oddly personal. It reminded him of something, but he couldn't place what. He stood there for a moment, breathing it in, trying to remember. Then the memory hit him. He was 7 years old, sitting in his grandmother's kitchen in a house he'd never actually visited. She was baking cookies, and he was doing homework at the table. The sun was coming through lace curtains, and there was a canary in a cage by the window singing. The memory was vivid, more real than most of his actual childhood memories. He could feel the texture of the wooden table under his hands, could taste the cookie dough his grandmother had let him sample, could hear her humming as she worked. The only problem was, Caspian had never had a grandmother who baked. Both his grandmothers had died before he was born, and he'd never sat in a kitchen like the one in his memory. He'd never lived in a house with lace curtains or owned a canary. The memory wasn't his, but it felt like his. He shook it off and went to work. But all day, he kept thinking about that kitchen, that grandmother. The memory had weight to it, emotional resonance. He felt nostalgia for something that had never happened to him. Other residents of the 3rd floor started reporting similar experiences. They'd smell the scent in the hallway and suddenly remember things that weren't their memories, lives they'd never lived, people they'd never met. A woman in 306, Bryony Mather, remembered being a soldier in War II, dying on a beach in France. But Bryony was 29 years old and had never been in the military. A man in 308, Takumi Gaines, remembered giving birth to 3 children and raising them in a small town in northern Ontario. But Takumi was a man, had never been pregnant, had no children. An elderly couple in 310, the Haverfords, remembered being teenagers in love in the 1960s, but in each other's bodies. Mr. Haverford remembered being young Mrs. Haverford, and she remembered being young him. The memories weren't vague or dreamlike. They were specific and detailed and felt completely real. And they were accumulating. People would smell the scent multiple times, and each time they'd get new memories. Layers of other lives building up in their minds. The building management tried everything to get rid of the smell. They cleaned the hallways, checked for mold, inspected the ventilation. But the smell persisted, and it was spreading. By the end of the month, it had reached the 2nd floor. By April, it was in the lobby. Residents started comparing notes. They realized the memories weren't random. They were connected. Caspian's memory of his grandmother matched the childhood home described by someone on the 4th floor. Bryony's memory of dying in France matched the war experiences remembered by someone in the building next door. It was like they were all remembering pieces of the same sprawling lives, distributed randomly among different people. The theory that emerged was disturbing. The memories weren't just random. They belonged to real people who'd actually lived. The smell was somehow pulling memories from the past, from lives that had been lived and ended, and distributing them to whoever breathed it in. The building became a repository of other people's lives. Residents walked around with heads full of experiences that weren't theirs. They'd go to places they'd never been but remembered. They'd have skills they'd never learned. They'd grieve for people they'd never met. Some residents moved out, but the smell followed them. Once you'd breathed it in, once you'd taken on those memories, the smell stayed with you. It would appear in your new home, in your car, at your workplace. And each time you smelled it, you'd get more memories, more layers of other lives piling on top of your own. Caspian stopped going to work. He couldn't function anymore. He had so many memories now that he couldn't remember which ones were really his. He'd look at photos from his actual childhood and not recognize them. He'd call his parents and not know who they were. His real life was being buried under dozens of false lives. He wasn't alone. Across Ottawa, people who'd lived in or visited the apartment building were experiencing the same thing. A few of them started meeting, trying to map out the memories, trying to understand the pattern. What they found was horrifying. The memories all came from people who died in Ottawa. Not recently. Some of the memories dated back 100 years or more. It was like the city itself was holding on to the experiences of everyone who'd ever died there. And somehow, that apartment building had become a leak point. A place where the accumulated memories of the dead were seeping back into the living. And it was getting worse. The smell was appearing in more locations. Other buildings, public spaces, shops. The memories were spreading. Soon, it seemed, everyone in Ottawa would be carrying around the lives of the dead, unable to distinguish their own experiences from the borrowed ones. Caspian's last coherent message to the group was in May. He said he'd counted 47 different complete lives in his head. 47 different people he'd apparently been. He couldn't remember his own name anymore without checking his ID. He said he was starting to forget how to distinguish between the memories. They were all mixing together, creating impossible histories, contradictory timelines. He said he felt like he was becoming a composite, not a person, but a collection. A living archive of everyone who'd ever breathed their last breath in Ottawa. The building was eventually condemned and emptied. The official reason was structural issues. But everyone knew the real reason. The smell was too strong there. The memories too thick. Anyone who spent more than an hour in the building would come out changed, their head full of other people's lives. But here's what they don't tell you. The smell hasn't stopped spreading. It's appeared in other cities now. Toronto, Montreal, Kingston, always starting in one building, one specific location, and then spreading outward. Always bringing memories that don't belong to the people who remember them. And the people who've been affected, people like Caspian, they're still out there, walking around with heads full of borrowed lives. Sometimes they'll talk to you and slip into speaking as someone else, remembering things that happened decades before they were born. They say memory makes us who we are. But what happens when your memories aren't yours? What happens when you're carrying around the entire history of a city in your mind, unable to find yourself among all the other selves you've become? That's the question Caspian Holtz asks himself every day. Or at least, one of the people in his head asks that question. It might not even be the original Caspian anymore. It might be one of the 47 others, wondering who they used to be before they became part of the collection. Story 7. The Extra Lane. Highway 401, the busiest highway in North America, stretches across southern Ontario. During rush hour, it's a nightmare of traffic and construction. But some drivers have reported finding a way to avoid the congestion, an extra lane that appears only under specific conditions. Zelda Parrish was a truck driver, hauling freight between Windsor and Toronto 3 times a week. She knew every kilometer of the 401, every exit, every traffic pattern. She'd been driving the route for 15 years. The first time she saw the extra lane, it was 3 in the morning on a Thursday. Light traffic, clear roads. She was westbound, just past the 400 interchange, when she noticed lane markings she'd never seen before. A 4th lane, appearing on the left side of the highway, marked with white lines that seemed to glow faintly in her headlights. She'd driven this stretch thousands of times. There was no 4th lane. But there it was, empty and inviting. And more importantly, it seemed to bypass a construction zone ahead. She could see traffic merging and slowing, but the 4th lane continued straight. Zelda, tired and wanting to make good time, took it. The lane was smooth, perfectly maintained. No potholes, no cracks. The lines were crisp and white. She accelerated, passing the construction zone, watching as the other lanes disappeared behind her. She was making incredible time, the kilometer markers flying by faster than seemed possible. She drove in that lane for what felt like 20 minutes. But when she checked her GPS, she'd covered 150 kilometers. That wasn't possible at highway speed. She should have covered maybe 30 kilometers in 20 minutes. The 4th lane merged back into the regular highway near London. Zelda took the merge, and suddenly everything was normal. 3 lanes, regular traffic, familiar landmarks. She checked her dashboard clock. She'd lost 2 hours. It was 5 in the morning now, not 3:20 like it should have been. She told herself she'd fallen asleep, lost time somehow. But her truck's logs showed she'd been driving continuously. No stops, no breaks. The truck had traveled 150 kilometers, but time had passed as if she'd gone much further. Zelda started asking other truckers about it. Most looked at her like she was crazy, but a very few, admitted they'd seen it too. The 4th lane that appeared late at night. The lane that let you cover distance faster than should be possible. They called it the Phantom Lane, or the Quick Lane. Some truckers actively looked for it, trying to save time on their routes. But no one could predict when it would appear or where. It seemed random, showing up in different sections of the 401, always late at night, always when traffic was light. Zelda saw it again a month later. This time she was prepared. She had her phone ready to film, her GPS tracking. She entered the 4th lane near Woodstock, heading east. The lane felt different this time. The air inside her truck got cold. Her radio started picking up stations that weren't on her preset list. Talk shows in languages she didn't recognize. News programs reporting events she'd never heard of. A traffic report for sections of the 401 that didn't exist. She looked to her right, at the regular lanes. The other cars looked wrong. Old models she hadn't seen in years, mixed with vehicles she didn't recognize. She saw a transport truck with a company logo she'd never seen, hauling equipment that looked almost alien. The kilometer markers were passing faster now. She was doing 120, but the markers suggested she was moving at 200, 300. Distance collapsing, eating itself. Her GPS stopped working. The screen showed her position jumping erratically, placing her in different parts of Ontario simultaneously. Near Thunder Bay, near Ottawa, near places that weren't even marked on the map. She tried to exit the 4th lane, but there were no merge points. It just continued, arrow straight, cutting through sections of highway she knew should have curves. She passed exits she recognized, but they looked different, wrong somehow. Interchange configurations that didn't match her memory. After what her clock said was 30 minutes, but what felt like hours, the 4th lane finally merged back. Zelda found herself near Kingston, 400 kilometers from where she'd entered the lane. Her truck logs showed continuous driving at normal speeds, but she'd covered a distance that should have taken 4 hours. Her clock said it had been 33 minutes. She pulled over, shaking. She checked her phone footage, but it showed only static and darkness. Her GPS history was corrupted, showing impossible routes. She started researching, digging into accident reports and traffic data for the 401. She found patterns. Unexplained disappearances of drivers who'd last been seen on the highway late at night. Traffic cameras showing vehicles entering one stretch of highway and never appearing on cameras further down the route. Time gaps in toll records, where cars would enter at one point and exit hours later than should be physically possible. And she found references, buried in old highway construction documents, to a 4th lane that was planned but never built. Or at least, supposedly never built. The documents were contradictory, some saying the lane was canceled, others saying it was completed. The construction records didn't match. There were photos showing 3 lanes and photos showing 4, both allegedly from the same time period. Zelda became obsessed. She started driving the 401 at night, specifically looking for the 4th lane. She found it 3 more times. Each time, the experience was stranger. The radio stations became more alien. The other vehicles more wrong. The distance covered more impossible. On her 5th trip into the 4th lane, she saw something that made her never want to use it again. There were other drivers in the lane with her now. Cars and trucks she'd seen on previous trips. But they weren't moving relative to her. They maintained the same positions, like they were frozen in place or moving at exactly her speed. She tried to pass one, a blue sedan, and couldn't. It stayed alongside her, perfectly matched, even when she changed speed. She looked at the driver. It was a man, middle-aged, staring straight ahead. His hands were on the wheel, but they weren't moving. He wasn't blinking. She honked her horn, but he didn't react. She looked at the other vehicles. All the same. Drivers frozen, unmoving, hands on wheels, eyes forward, like puppets, like shells. That's when she realized, maybe the 4th lane doesn't just move you through space faster. Maybe it moves you through something else. Maybe the drivers she was seeing were people who'd taken the lane and never found their way back to the regular highway. Trapped in the phantom lane, driving forever, covering impossible distances, existing in the gaps between the real kilometers of the 401. Zelda managed to merge back that time, but she was different. Her truck's odometer showed she'd put 50,000 extra kilometers on it during her trips into the fourth lane, even though she'd only been gone for cumulative hours. Her GPS permanently showed ghost routes, phantom highways overlaid on real ones. She quit long-haul driving. Too risky. But she still hears from other truckers who've taken the fourth lane. Some of them send her messages, describing the same frozen drivers, the same impossible distances. Some of the messages are months or years old, even though they were sent recently. Time doesn't work right for people who've been in the phantom lane. And sometimes, late at night, Zelda will be driving on regular roads and see it out of the corner of her eye. An extra lane appearing beside the normal ones. Lane markings that glow faintly, promising faster travel, shorter routes. She never takes it anymore, because she's realized the truth. The fourth lane isn't a shortcut through space. It's something else. Something older, running parallel to the 401. And every time you take it, you leave a little bit of yourself there. You become a little less real, a little more like those frozen drivers trapped in their eternal commute. The 401 is the busiest highway in North America. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles every day, millions of kilometers traveled. But how many of those vehicles are real? How many are just shadows, echoes of drivers who took the quick lane and never quite made it back? Next time you're driving the 401 late at night, count the lanes. Make sure you're seeing what's really there. Because if you see a fourth lane, if you see lane markings that glow just a little too brightly, keep driving straight. Don't take the exit. Don't take the shortcut. Some distances can't be shortened. Some routes can't be rushed. And the 401 has been around long enough, has seen enough traffic, that maybe it's developed its own shortcuts, its own logic, its own appetite for drivers willing to trade reality for convenience. Zelda Parrish knows this now. She drives only during the day, only on surface streets. She tells her story to anyone who'll listen. She's trying to save people from making her mistake. But every month, more truckers disappear from the 401. More GPS logs show impossible routes. More cameras record vehicles entering the highway and never coming out. The phantom lane is always there, somewhere, waiting for the next driver desperate enough or tired enough to take it. And once you do, once you've driven those impossible kilometers, you can never quite trust distance again. Story 8. The Borrowed Book. Libraries across Ontario are connected through a shared catalog system. You can request a book from any library in the network, and it'll be delivered to your local branch. It's convenient, efficient, and mostly automated. But sometimes the system delivers books that shouldn't exist. Quinn Roberge was a librarian in Peterborough, working the evening shift at the downtown branch. She was processing returned books, scanning them back into the system, when she noticed something odd. A book had been returned that wasn't in the catalog. The book was called The Margins of Reality by someone named Sebastian Fell. It was a slim hardcover with a plain blue binding and no dust jacket. Quinn scanned the barcode, but the system didn't recognize it. She tried searching by title and author. Nothing. No record of this book anywhere in the provincial library system. What was strange was that the book had clearly been borrowed. It had a due date slip inside, stamped with the library's name and a return date. But there was no corresponding checkout record. According to the system, this book had never been borrowed because this book didn't exist. Quinn was curious by nature, which is probably why she'd become a librarian. She opened the book and started reading. It was a novel, or maybe a memoir, about a person who lived in the margins of reality. Not metaphorically, literally in the margins. The narrator existed in the spaces between moments, in the gaps between people's perceptions. They could observe life, but couldn't fully participate in it. They were always just slightly out of sync with the world, invisible and untouchable. The writing was beautiful and deeply unsettling. The more Quinn read, the more the descriptions felt familiar. The narrator would describe walking through crowds unnoticed, speaking without being heard, reaching out to touch things, and passing through them like a ghost. Quinn had experienced that. Everyone has. Those moments where you feel disconnected, where the world seems slightly unreal. But the book described it as a permanent state, a way of existing that some people were trapped in. She brought the book home, intending to read more and figure out where it had come from. Maybe it was a self-published book, something someone had donated that got processed incorrectly. But that night, she started noticing things. The book would appear in different places in her apartment. She'd leave it on the coffee table, and it would be on her nightstand. She'd put it in her bag, and it would be back on the shelf, like it was moving on its own, repositioning itself. And there were more due date slips inside now. Dozens of them, from libraries all across Ontario. Different dates, different branches, some dating back decades. The book had been circulating for years, but there was no record of it anywhere. Quinn tried to research Sebastian Fell, the author. No results, no publisher information, no copyright date, no ISBN. The book was professionally made, not a homemade effort, but it had no identifying information beyond the author's name and title. She went to work the next day and asked other librarians about it. No one had seen it before. But as she was showing it to her co-worker, another copy appeared in the returns bin. Same book, same blue binding. Then another. By the end of her shift, 6 copies of The Margins of Reality had been returned to their library, none with any checkout records, all filled with due date slips from libraries across the province. Quinn kept 1 copy and started documenting everything. She checked with other libraries, and they reported the same thing. Copies of this book were appearing everywhere, always in returns, never checked out, and patrons were asking about it. People would come to the desk saying they'd finished reading The Margins of Reality and wanted to recommend it to friends. But when librarians searched for it in the catalog, it wasn't there. The book was somehow circulating itself, moving through the library system without being officially in the system. Quinn made the mistake of reading it cover to cover. The ending was disturbing. The narrator realized that they weren't trapped in the margins accidentally. They'd become a margin themselves. They were the blank space between the text, the white space, the nothing that makes the something visible. And the more people read about them, the more they solidified into that role. They were becoming real as a concept, but losing reality as a person. The book ended with the narrator speaking directly to the reader. If you're reading this, you've helped make me more real. But in exchange, I've taken a small piece of your reality. You've given me substance by observing me, and now you're slightly less substantial. Don't worry, you'll barely notice. Just a feeling sometimes that the world is slightly less solid than it used to be. After finishing the book, Quinn started experiencing exactly what it described. She'd be in conversations, and people would talk over her like she wasn't there. She'd send emails that never got responses. She'd walk into rooms, and no one would acknowledge her presence. It was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as people being distracted or rude. But it got worse. She'd leave work and realize no one had spoken directly to her all day. She'd call her family, and they'd answer but not seem to hear her words. She'd post online, and her posts wouldn't get any engagement, as if they were invisible. She tried to return the book to the library, but it wouldn't stay returned. It would appear in her apartment again, always open to the same page. You've given me substance by observing me, and now you're slightly less substantial. Other people who'd read the book were reporting similar experiences. A support group formed online, people from across Ontario who'd all read the margins of reality, and were all slowly fading from the world. They compared notes, tried to find solutions. Some of them had read the book multiple times. Those people were fading faster. One woman reported that she'd become completely invisible. She could walk through a crowded mall and not have a single person's eyes even flicker in her direction. She'd scream, and no one would hear. She'd reached the final margin, the complete absence. The library system tried to pull all copies of the book from circulation. But they couldn't find them all. New copies kept appearing, and worse, people were borrowing them. The due date slips kept accumulating, proving that someone was checking out these books that didn't exist in the system. Quinn became determined to find Sebastian Fell, the author. If someone had written this book, maybe they'd know how to reverse its effects. She searched records, contacted publishers, even hired a private investigator. What they found was impossible. Sebastian Fell had been a real person, a librarian like Quinn, who'd worked in Toronto in the 1950s. He'd written one book, The Margins of Reality, but no publisher would take it. Too strange, too unsettling. He'd died in 1962, and his manuscript had been lost. Or supposedly lost, because somehow his unpublished manuscript had become a real book, a book that circulated through libraries, that people borrowed and read, that existed in physical form despite never being officially published. The theory Quinn developed was that Fell himself had become what he'd written about. He'd faded into the margins so completely that he'd become part of the library system itself. An idea rather than a person. And his book was his way of pulling others into the margins with him, creating company in the blank spaces. Quinn's last documented appearance was 3 months after she first found the book. She posted in the online support group, saying she'd figured it out. She said the margins weren't empty. They were full of people like Fell, like her, like everyone who'd read the book. They were all there, existing in the spaces between, watching the real world but unable to touch it. She said she could see them now. Thousands of people, maybe millions, all living in the margins of reality. People who'd faded so completely that the world forgot them. They weren't dead. They were just adjacent, parallel, existing in the negative space. No one has heard from Quinn since that post. Her apartment was found empty, all her belongings still there, but no sign of her. Her job still has her on, the schedule, but her time cards show weeks of no clock-ins. Her family reports she simply stopped existing to them, like she was someone they'd dreamed about rather than someone real. The book is still circulating. Libraries across Ontario report finding copies in their returns. And people keep reading it, drawn to its strange narrative, not realizing that reading it is accepting a transaction. Your attention for its reality, your substance for its existence. If you ever find a slim blue hardcover called The Margins of Reality by Sebastian Fell, don't read it. Don't even open it. Because once you've given it your attention, once you've observed the narrator and made them real in your mind, you've agreed to trade places. You've agreed to fade, slowly but inevitably, into the margins yourself. And the margins are crowded now. So very crowded with people who used to be real, who used to exist fully in the world. People like Quinn Roberge, like Sebastian Fell, like countless others, whose names have been forgotten because names need someone to remember them, and people in the margins can't remember each other. They can only watch, only observe, only exist in the blank spaces between the words of reality. Story 9. The Intersection. At the corner of Bloor Street and Christie Street in Toronto, there's an intersection that doesn't obey the normal rules of time and space. Not always, just sometimes. But when it doesn't, people disappear. Maven Cordero was a bike courier, 26 years old, fast and fearless in Toronto traffic. She knew every street, every shortcut, every traffic light pattern. She'd been through the Bloor and Christie intersection hundreds of times. On a Tuesday in October 2022, she was making a delivery downtown. Rush hour, heavy traffic, typical Toronto chaos. She approached the intersection heading west on Bloor. The light was red. She stopped, one foot on the curb, waiting with a cluster of other cyclists and pedestrians. The light changed to green. Maven pushed off and entered the intersection. She never came out the other side. According to witnesses, she simply vanished halfway through. One moment she was there, visible and solid, pedaling through the crosswalk. The next moment, gone. Her bike continued for a few more feet, riderless before tipping over. The witnesses called police. They searched the area, reviewed traffic camera footage. The footage showed exactly what the witnesses described. Maven entered the intersection and disappeared. Not quickly, not like a trick of light. She just ceased to exist between one frame and the next. Search efforts found nothing. No trace of Maven Cordero. Her phone's last GPS ping was from the middle of the intersection. Then nothing. Her partner, Riley, refused to accept it. They started investigating, talking to other people who'd been at that intersection. And they found a pattern. Over the past 15 years, 7 people had disappeared at Bloor and Christie. Always during rush hour. Always in the middle of crossing. No bodies, no evidence, just people ceasing to exist. Riley started monitoring the intersection, standing on the corner for hours, watching traffic, recording everything. They interviewed drivers and pedestrians, collecting stories. Some people reported strange experiences at that intersection. Moments of disorientation, of time feeling wrong. One woman said she'd entered the crosswalk and felt like she'd been walking for hours, even though she'd crossed in seconds. A man reported seeing people in the intersection who weren't really there, shadows of pedestrians that disappeared when he looked directly at them. Riley found references to the intersection in city records. In the 1960s, there had been plans to build a subway station there. Construction had started, tunnels dug, but the project was abandoned due to geological instabilities. The records were vague about what that meant. Riley got access to the old construction documents. The tunnels beneath the intersection had been partially built, then sealed. But the notes from the construction crew were disturbing. They reported spatial anomalies in the tunnels. Corridors that seemed longer than they should be. Chambers that shouldn't fit in the physical space. Sounds coming from directions that didn't exist. The project had been abandoned when a crew of 5 workers disappeared in the tunnels. They'd been working on expanding a chamber beneath the intersection. According to the last radio transmission, they'd broken through into a space that shouldn't be there, a vast cavity that the geological surveys hadn't shown. No bodies were recovered. The tunnels were sealed with concrete, and the project was officially canceled. Riley became convinced that whatever was in those tunnels was still there, still active, and it was reaching up into the intersection above, taking people down into wherever those workers had gone. They tried to get the city to investigate, but no one would listen. The disappearances were too spread out, too random. There was no proof of a pattern beyond Riley's research. So Riley decided to test the theory themselves. They went to the intersection during rush hour, set up cameras, and deliberately crossed during the time when disappearances had historically occurred. They made it across safely, but their footage showed something impossible. There were extra pedestrians in the crosswalk with them. People Riley didn't remember seeing. People who looked wrong, their movements slightly off, their faces blurred. And these shadow pedestrians didn't make it to the other side. They'd fade halfway through the intersection, dissolving into the pavement. Riley enhanced the footage, zoomed in on the shadow pedestrians, and realized with horror that one of them was Maven. They could see her face, could see her bike. She was there in the footage, crossing the intersection over and over, fading each time, like a loop that couldn't complete. Riley went back to the intersection at night, when traffic was light. They brought equipment, borrowed from friends who did paranormal investigation. EMF readers, thermal cameras, audio recorders. The readings were insane. Massive electromagnetic fluctuations in the center of the intersection. Temperature drops of 20 degrees in specific spots. And sounds, recorded on frequencies below human hearing, that when played back, sped up, sounded like voices. Dozens of voices, all talking at once, all saying variations of the same thing. Where are the walls? I can't find the walls. Riley realized the intersection wasn't just taking people. It was keeping them. Maven and the others who'd disappeared were trapped in some kind of spatial loop, existing in the moment of crossing, unable to complete the journey. Stuck between one side of the street and the other, in a space that was somehow vast and endless. The old construction tunnels hadn't been sealed because of geological instabilities. They'd been sealed because the workers had found something beneath the city. A void, a space that didn't follow normal geometry. And that void was slowly expanding upward, reaching the surface, creating a trap at the intersection above. Riley tried everything to get Maven back. They contacted physicists, urban explorers, anyone who might help. Most thought they were crazy, but a few took them seriously. A professor from U of T came to measure the intersection and confirmed Riley's findings. The space was wrong there, bent somehow, like a pit you couldn't see. The city finally took action. They closed the intersection for infrastructure repairs. But the repairs were a cover. They were trying to figure out what to do about a hole in reality in the middle of a busy intersection. The current solution is temporary. They've installed traffic lights that change in a specific pattern, designed to minimize the time anyone spends in the center of the intersection. They've redirected traffic when possible. They monitor the area constantly. But people still disappear sometimes. Not as often, but it still happens. Someone will cross at the wrong moment, hit the wrong spot in the intersection, and fall through into whatever is beneath. Riley still stands on that corner most days. Still watching, still recording. They've seen Maven's shadow 3 more times, always in the footage, never visible in person. Always crossing, always fading, always trapped in that endless moment. And sometimes, late at night, if you stand in the middle of the Bloor and Christie intersection, you can feel it. The way the space doesn't quite fit together. The way the ground seems less solid than it should be. The sense that you're standing on thin ice over something vast and empty and hungry. The city keeps monitoring, keeps watching, because they know the truth now. Toronto isn't built on solid ground. There are spaces beneath it, voids and gaps, places where reality thins. And at Bloor and Christie, the surface has worn through completely. 7 people are lost there. Maybe more. Trapped in the crossing, unable to reach either side, existing in the moment of disappearance forever. And the intersection keeps waiting, keeps taking, keeps feeding the void beneath with anyone unlucky enough to hit the exact wrong spot at the exact wrong time. Maven Cordero was a real person. Riley still has their photo, their belongings, their memory. But Maven is also a shadow now, visible only on recordings, crossing an intersection they'll never finish crossing. Some journeys don't have destinations. Some crossings never end. And in Toronto, at one specific intersection, the distance between one side of the street and the other is infinite. Story 10. The Sound. In the small town of Elora, north of Guelph, there's a sound that plays at 3:17 a.m. every morning. Not everyone hears it, but those who do are changed forever. The sound started in January 2023. The first person to report it was Royce Clemens, a baker who was up early preparing bread. He was working in his kitchen when he heard it. A low tone, barely audible, more felt than heard. It resonated in his chest, in his bones, in his teeth. The tone lasted for exactly 3 minutes. When it stopped, Royce felt different. He couldn't explain how. Just different. Changed in some fundamental way. He went about his day, but things felt wrong. Colors looked slightly off. Sounds had strange echoes. People's faces seemed unfamiliar even when he'd known them for years. It was like the world had shifted slightly, had become a copy of itself, rather than the original. The next night, at 3:17 a.m., the sound came again. Royce was ready this time, trying to identify it. But the sound defied identification. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't animal, wasn't anything he recognized. It was just a tone, pure and singular, vibrating through everything. And again, when it stopped, the world was different. More different. Royce noticed objects in his bakery that he'd never seen before. A shelf he didn't remember installing. A window in a different position. Small changes, but definitely changes. He asked his wife if she'd heard the sound. She looked at him confused. What sound? She'd been asleep, heard nothing unusual. Royce started documenting the changes. He'd take photos before the sound and after. The differences were subtle but real. The bakery's layout would shift slightly. The street outside would have different cars parked. The view from his window would include buildings at slightly different angles. He wasn't alone. Others in Elora started reporting similar experiences. A teenager named Haven Sykes heard the sound and noticed his bedroom rearranging itself. Same furniture, same belongings, but configured differently each morning. A woman named Orlena Voss heard the sound and found her garden growing different plants. She'd planted roses, but morning glory vines appeared overnight. The people who heard the sound started meeting, comparing notes. There were 12 of them, and they all agreed. Each time the sound played, Elora changed. Not drastically, but measurably. Like the town was being slowly edited, rewritten, shifted into a different configuration. The scariest part was that only they noticed. People who didn't hear the sound couldn't see the changes. To them, Elora was constant, stable, always the same. But to the 12 who heard the sound, the town was transforming night by night. Royce brought in audio equipment, trying to record the sound. Recordings picked up nothing. Just ambient noise, the hum of appliances, the creak of his house. The sound existed only for those who could hear it. A researcher from the university came to investigate, Dr. Leith Westbrook, who studied acoustics and perception. He stayed in Elora, set up monitoring equipment, waited for 3:17 a.m. The sound played. Dr. Westbrook heard nothing. His equipment recorded nothing. But Royce and the others heard it clearly, and when it stopped, they could all see the changes. A new shop on the main street that hadn't been there before. A war memorial with different names. A church steeple that was now a different color. Dr. Westbrook couldn't see any of it. To him, Elora looked exactly as it always had. The disconnect was maddening. How do you prove changes that only you can perceive? The 12 decided to document everything exhaustively. They'd walk the town every day, photograph every building, every street, every detail. Then they'd compare after the sound played. The changes accelerated. Not just physical changes anymore. Historical changes. They'd check old newspapers in the library and find articles that had different headlines than they remembered. They'd talk to townspeople who'd tell stories about events that had never happened. The past was being rewritten along with the present. One morning, Royce woke up, and his wife was different. Not replaced. Still the same person, still his wife. But her personality was slightly altered. She had opinions she'd never had before, memories of experiences they'd never shared. She was becoming someone slightly different, and she didn't realize it. The 12 were changing too. Each morning after the sound, they'd check and find they'd changed in small ways. Physical features subtly different. Preferences shifted. Memories fuzzy. They were being rewritten along with the town. They tried to leave Elora, thinking distance might protect them. But wherever they went, at 3:17 a.m., they'd hear the sound. It followed them, or rather they were marked by it and couldn't escape. Dr. Westbrook had a theory. He suggested that reality isn't fixed. It's fluid, constantly being written and rewritten. Most people don't notice because they change along with it. Their memories adjust to match the new reality. But somehow the 12 had become aware of the process. They could perceive the edits, see the changes, feel reality being rewritten around them. The sound wasn't causing the changes, it was marking them, like a bell that rings to announce an update. The changes happened every moment of every day, but only when the sound played could the 12 perceive them, which meant they'd been hearing it all along, every morning at 3:17 a.m. for their entire lives. But they'd only become aware of it recently. And once you're aware, you can't become unaware. You can't stop noticing the edits. Royce started losing track of which version of Elora was real. He'd remember events that contradicted other memories. He'd know facts about the town's history that other people denied. His identity was fracturing, splitting into multiple versions, each one valid in a different configuration of reality. The other 11 were experiencing the same thing. They'd meet and try to agree on basic facts, but couldn't. Each one remembered slightly different versions of events, saw slightly different versions of the town. They were diverging, becoming untethered from a single reality. Dr. Westbrook's final note before he left Elora was this: "They're not going crazy. Reality is genuinely fluid around them. But the problem is, once you can see that, once you're aware that everything is constantly being rewritten, you lose your anchor. You become unstuck. And without an anchor, you drift through possibilities, never settling on one reality." The 12 are still in Elora, most of them. Some have disappeared, though disappeared might not be the right word. They've diverged, so far, into alternate configurations that they no longer exist in this version of Elora. Or maybe they exist, but have become so different that no one recognizes them anymore. Royce still runs his bakery, or something that looks like his bakery, but every morning, he's a slightly different Royce. And Elora is a slightly different Elora. The sound plays at 3:17 a.m., and everything shifts, and only he can perceive it. He doesn't know which version of himself is real anymore. Maybe all of them. Maybe none of them. He exists in the space between configurations, aware of the edits but unable to stop them, watching as reality rewrites itself around him, night after night after night. And the sound keeps playing. Every morning at 3:17 a.m., in Elora and maybe other places too, a tone that marks the moment of change, the moment when reality admits it's not as solid as we pretend. Most people will never hear it. They'll live their lives in blissful ignorance, unaware that they're being edited, rewritten, configured into slightly different versions of themselves. But once you hear it, once you become aware, you can never go back. You're marked, you're awake, you're watching the edits happen in real time, and you realize the horrible truth. There is no fixed reality. There's just an endless series of configurations, shifting and changing, and we're all being rewritten constantly. The only difference is whether you notice. Royce notices. The other members of the 12 notice. And now, maybe, you'll notice too. Because once the idea is in your head, once you're listening for it, you might hear it. That low tone at 3:17 a.m., the sound of reality being edited. And once you hear it, everything changes, including you.